Two police officers shot an Army combat nurse in a hospital parking garage, and before the blood had dried on the concrete, armed military vehicles were already rolling toward the precinct. The officers thought their badges were armor. They had no idea the woman bleeding out on level 3 of the Harmon Medical Center parking structure had pulled wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles under enemy fire, had earned commendations that most officers would never see in 3 lifetimes, and had a service record that was about to dismantle everything they thought they were protected by. They chose the wrong woman, and they were about to find out exactly what that meant. If this story already has your attention, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rain had started around 7 that evening, the kind of cold, sideways rain that made the western Kentucky air feel like a wet wool blanket pressed against your face. Sergeant First Class Mara Linfield, retired, though she never quite felt the word fit, pulled her jacket tighter as she crossed the sky bridge connecting Harmon Medical Center's south wing to the parking structure on Delacroix Avenue. She was still wearing her Army-issue fleece over her scrubs, the one with the 68 Badobilato patch on the left shoulder that she'd never bothered to remove. It wasn't vanity, it was just habit, the same way she still woke at 0500 without an alarm and still checked exits whenever she walked into a room. Mara was 33 years old, 5'6", with dark brown hair she kept in a tight braid because anything loose got in the way during a shift. She had a small scar along her left jaw from a piece of shrapnel she'd taken outside Kandahar, barely visible unless the light hit it right. Most people at Harmon didn't know it was there. Most people at Harmon didn't know much about Mara at all, which was how she preferred it. She had been working as a civilian trauma nurse in Harmon's emergency department for 14 months. Before that, she had spent 9 years in the Army, 3 deployments, 2 of them combat, one of them the kind that didn't make it into public briefings. She'd left the service not because she was pushed out, but because the thing she was best at, keeping people alive in conditions where survival seemed arithmetically impossible, was needed in places that weren't war zones. Or so she'd told herself. The truth was more complicated, and she wasn't in the habit of examining it too closely. The parking garage on Delacroix was connected to Harmon's employee lot. It was the kind of structure that always felt slightly threatening after dark. Low ceilings, bad lighting on levels 2 and 3, the smell of exhaust and rain coming up from the street. Mara had parked on level 3 because it was the only open spots when she'd arrived for her shift at noon. That had been nearly 12 hours ago. She was carrying a gray equipment case, standard hospital issue, about the size of a laptop bag, that contained a portable defibrillator that the ED had sent for recalibration at the in-house biomedical unit on the 4th floor. She had signed for it at checkout and was bringing it back to the department after the tech ran the diagnostic. It was routine. She'd done it before. She was halfway across the parking level, keys in hand, when she heard footsteps behind her moving too fast to be casual. "Stop! Don't move!" Mara stopped. She turned slowly, hands visible, the case hanging from her right hand by the carry strap. 2 officers in Calverton PD uniforms had come through the stairwell door. The one on the left, young, maybe 26, with a rigid jaw and the kind of posture that telegraphed he was trying to look more certain than he felt, had his hand on his holster. The one on the right was broader, older, with flat eyes and a name tag she could just make out in the garage's weak fluorescent light. Decker. The younger one's tag read Price. "Set the bag down," Decker said. "The bag belongs to Harmon Medical," Mara said. She kept her voice level. "It's a defibrillator case. I'm a nurse on the ED staff. I can show you my hospital ID." "Set the bag down first." She set it down. She straightened slowly, hands at shoulder level. "ID's in my left breast pocket," she said. Price moved forward, pulled the lanyard from her jacket, looked at the card. Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition, but a kind of recalibration, like he was adjusting to information that didn't match what he'd expected. "What's the Army ID for?" he asked. "I'm a veteran," Mara said. "That's my military identification. I carried it for 9 years and I didn't stop when I got out." "Where'd you get the case?" Decker asked. He hadn't moved. His hand was still near his weapon. "I signed it out of biomedical, 4th floor. There's a log. You can call the department, they'll confirm it." She paused. "What was the report? Who called this in?" "We asked the questions," Decker said. "Okay." Mara kept her hands up. Then ask them. I'll wait. What she didn't know yet, what she would find out later, was that the call had come from a parking attendant named Russ Cody, who had a personal grievance with the hospital's security staff and had decided, for reasons that were either petty or calculated, to file a theft report on a woman he'd seen carrying a case he didn't recognize. Cody had described the suspect as acting suspicious and probably not staff. He had not mentioned that she was wearing scrubs. He had not mentioned the hospital ID badge clearly visible around her neck. Price handed the ID back to Decker, who looked at it and then looked at Mara with an expression she had seen before. Not on the street, but in certain rooms and certain briefings, in the particular way some people looked at a woman in uniform and saw a costume rather than a record. "Take the jacket off," Decker said. Mara blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The army jacket. Take it off." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's not a reasonable request." "It is when I'm asking it." "I've shown you my hospital ID and my military identification," Mara said. "I've told you where the case came from and offered you a way to verify it in about 90 seconds. Taking my jacket off has nothing to do with any of that." Decker stepped forward. "You being difficult right now?" "No, I'm being precise." She kept her voice flat. Not aggressive, not scared, precise. It was the voice she used when a patient was crashing and someone in the room was starting to panic. "There's a difference." What happened next lasted less than 4 seconds. Price reached for the equipment case. Mara's instinct, trained automatic, the same reflex that had kept her alive in 2 combat zones, moved her hand toward the case to keep it from hitting the ground, because the defibrillator inside was fragile and had just been calibrated and she had signed for it. Decker drew his weapon. He said something, but Mara never fully heard it because the first shot came at the same moment. A flat, devastating crack that echoed off the concrete ceiling of the parking structure and hit her in the left shoulder. The impact spun her. She went into the side of a parked car, and the second shot caught her in the side, just below the ribs. She went down. The equipment case hit the floor beside her. She heard Price saying something into his radio, his voice tight and fast. The cadence of someone constructing a version of events in real time. She heard the word weapon. She heard reached. What she felt was the cold of the garage floor against her cheek, the spreading warmth of blood through her scrubs, and the very clear, very specific thought, not panicked, not desperate, but clinical, that the wound to her side had missed her liver but probably nicked something she'd need pressure on immediately. She pressed her own hand to the wound. She had done this before, in the field, for other people. She did not lose consciousness. The Harmon Medical Center Emergency Department had seen a lot of bad nights, but the radio call that came through at 7:42 p.m. on a Tuesday produced a kind of controlled chaos that the staff would remember for a long time. A nurse had been shot in the parking garage. Not a patient, not a bystander, a nurse. The trauma team was at the elevator before the gurney arrived. Mara Linfield was conscious when they brought her up, pale, losing blood at a rate that needed to be addressed in the next few minutes, but conscious. She told the trauma surgeon, Dr. Asha Okafor, exactly where she'd been hit, what she thought the trajectory was, and asked specifically about vascular involvement in the lower wound before she let them put her under. Okafor would tell the charge nurse afterward that she'd never had a gunshot patient give a more accurate self-assessment. "She told me it was the lower intercostal space, possible renal artery proximity, and then she closed her eyes," Okafor said. "Like she'd done everything she needed to do and was just waiting for us to catch up." The surgery lasted 3 hours and 11 minutes. The shoulder wound was serious but straightforward. Clean exit, no arterial involvement. The abdominal wound was the one that required work. A portion of the intestine had been nicked, the bleeding was significant, and Okafor spent the better part of 2 hours ensuring that everything that needed to be repaired was repaired in the right order. Mara survived. She was moved to the ICU at 11:30 p.m., with a drain in her side and a blood pressure that was low but stable. The nurses on night shift checked her every 20 minutes. Nobody said anything about what had happened in the garage. Nobody needed to. While Mara was in surgery, something else was happening. When the EMTs had taken her ID for processing during the call, the scan had picked up her military credentials, specifically the code on the back of her Army service card that flagged her as a veteran of classified operational assignments. It was a system built after a series of incidents in the early 2010s where veterans in crisis had been misidentified or mishandled by civilian emergency services. The flag existed to ensure that certain veterans, those with specific service histories, received appropriate notification protocols. It sent an alert. That alert went to a duty officer at Fort Caldwell, which was located 40 miles northeast of Calverton. The duty officer read the alert, noted the nature of the incident. An Army veteran with a classified service history had been shot by local law enforcement, and immediately escalated it. By midnight, the report was on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel Darnell Graves, commander of the 4th Military Police Investigative Unit out of Fort Caldwell. Graves read it once. He made 2 phone calls. Then he drove to Harmon Medical Center himself. The Calverton Police Department's version of events was circulating by 9 o'clock that evening, pushed out through the department's communications office with a speed that suggested it had been prepared in advance of any actual investigation. The statement described a confrontation with a suspect who had been observed removing hospital property and who had, according to responding officers, made a sudden movement toward a concealed object. Officers had discharged their weapons in response to a perceived threat. The suspect had been transported to Harmon Medical Center. An internal review was underway. The statement did not mention that the suspect was a nurse. It did not mention the hospital ID badge. It did not mention the equipment case, or what was in it, or the calibration log that would have taken 90 seconds to verify. What it did include, buried in the 3rd paragraph, was the phrase unclear whether identification was provided prior to the incident, which was the kind of language that could mean many things and which had been placed there deliberately. Inside the precinct, Officers Decker and Price had been separated and placed on administrative leave pending the review. That was standard procedure. What was less standard was what their shift supervisor, Sergeant Thomas Burrell, did in the 40 minutes immediately following the shooting. Burrell had received a call from the garage's attendant, Cody, the man who'd filed the original complaint, who was now worried about what he'd set in motion. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. After it ended, Burrell went to the precinct's evidence management room and accessed the file for the Harmon parking structure's external camera feed, which had been transferred as part of the initial incident documentation. He marked it corrupted. The original file, he believed, was gone. What Burrell did not know was that the Harmon Medical Center's parking structure had been upgraded with a redundant backup system 18 months earlier, after a legal dispute with an insurance company had made the hospital's board very particular about maintaining multiple copies of surveillance footage. That backup ran on a server maintained by the hospital's IT department, entirely separate from the feed that had been transferred to the police. The footage still existed, and it showed everything. Wow. Lieutenant Colonel Graves arrived at Harmon Medical at 12:40 a.m. He was accompanied by 2 members of his investigative unit, Warrant Officer Diana Pratt and Staff Sergeant Kevin Hollis, and a JAG officer named Captain Felicia Sue. They signed in at the reception desk, presented credentials, and asked to speak with hospital administration. The on-call administrator, a careful man named Walter Fenwick, met them in the conference room adjacent to the executive offices. Fenwick had been in hospital administration for 22 years and had dealt with plenty of difficult situations, but he had never had military investigators show up in the middle of the night. And the calm efficiency with which Graves moved through the room told Fenwick that this was not a visit he should try to control. "I'd like to see the incident report from tonight," Graves said. "Everything the hospital has. Intake documentation, the original police report, whatever your security office received." Fenwick produced it. Graves read the police statement. His expression didn't change. "I'd also like to see your surveillance footage from the parking structure, level 3, between 7:30 and 8 p.m. Fenwick hesitated. The police indicated that footage was— "I'm aware of what the police indicated," Graves said. "I'm asking what you have." There was a pause. "We have a backup system," Fenwick said carefully. "It runs independently of the feed that was transferred to the department. I'd like to see it." The footage was pulled up on the conference room screen at 1:15 a.m. Graves watched it without speaking. Pratt watched it. Hollis watched it. Sue, who had a yellow legal pad in front of her and had been taking notes since the moment she sat down, stopped writing and watched it. The footage was clear. The lighting was poor. It was a parking garage. But the sequence of events was unambiguous. Mara Linfield had walked across level 3 with a case on her shoulder. She had been stopped by 2 officers. She had turned slowly, hands visible. She had held up her ID. She had set the case down when asked. She had kept her hands at her sides until the moment Price reached for the case, at which point she had moved her hand toward it. not toward her body, not toward the officers, but toward the case, in an instinctive protective gesture that lasted less than half a second before Decker fired. The first shot hit her while she was still facing away. The second hit her when she was already going down. She had not reached for anything except the equipment she had been responsible for. Graves said nothing for a long moment after the footage ended. Then he looked at Sue. "They falsified the incident report," he said. It wasn't a question. "The statement claims she reached for a concealed object," Sue confirmed. "The footage doesn't support that." And the original footage was marked corrupted. "Within 40 minutes of the incident," Sue said. "Yes." "Get me everything," Graves said. "Body cameras, dispatch logs, communications between the officers and their command staff. All of it." He looked at the screen one more time. "And I want to know who made the call to suppress that feed." Mara woke up at 4 a.m. with a tube in her arm and a nurse she didn't recognize adjusting something on the IV stand beside her. The pain was significant. She'd been injured before, field injuries, the kind of thing that got you medevaced but not sent home, and once a real one that had kept her in a Bagram hospital bed for 3 weeks. She knew how to hold still, how to breathe through it, how to keep her face from doing the thing it wanted to do. She looked at the ceiling. White acoustic tile. The specific hum of a hospital at night, which was different from a hospital during the day. Quieter, more contained, like the building was holding its breath. The nurse noticed she was awake. "You're in the ICU at Harmon," the nurse said. "You came out of surgery about 4 hours ago. Try not to move too much." "How's the repair?" Mara asked. The nurse blinked. Dr. Okafor will be in at 6. She'll go over everything. I need to know if there was any vascular compromise in the lower wound. I don't have that information right now." "Okay." Mara looked back at the ceiling. "What time is it?" "Just after 4. She thought about the parking garage. About the way Decker had looked at the patch on her shoulder. Not with recognition, not with anything that resembled acknowledgement, but with the particular blankness of someone who had already decided what they were seeing and saw no reason to adjust. She thought about the equipment case on the floor and the calibration log that still existed in Biomedical's system, the one that had her name on it and a timestamp from 7:15 p.m., 27 minutes before Decker fired. She thought about the camera mounted in the corner of level 3, the one she'd noticed when she parked that afternoon because she always noticed cameras. It was a habit. You noticed exits and cameras and anything that could tell the truth after the fact, because in her experience, the truth was worth preserving and not everyone was interested in that. She hoped someone had pulled the footage. She did not know yet that someone had. By 6 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Graves had established a working evidence file that included the parking structure footage, the falsified police incident report, the body camera recordings from both Decker and Price, which contradicted the written statement in 17 specific points, and a dispatch log that showed the original call from Russ Cody had described the suspect as a woman in scrubs with a hospital bag, and had not used the words theft or weapon at any point. He also had, courtesy of Captain Sue, a preliminary background on Sergeant Thomas Burrell that included a complaint filed against him 8 months earlier by a detective in his own precinct alleging improper evidence handling in an unrelated case. That complaint had been reviewed by a superior and marked inconclusive. The picture was assembling itself into something that went beyond 2 officers who had made a catastrophic call in a parking garage. At 7:15 a.m., Graves requested Mara's military service record through Fort Caldwell's secure personnel system. It arrived at 7:43 a.m. He read it in full. Then he read it again. Mara Linfield had deployed 3 times, twice as part of forward support units in eastern Afghanistan, once as part of a rapid response medical element in a classified operation that was still partially redacted even in personnel files. She held the Combat Medical Badge. She held the Army Commendation Medal with Valor. She had been recommended for the Bronze Star after leading a field triage operation during a vehicle convoy ambush that had left her team's senior medic incapacitated, during which she had treated 11 casualties under active fire and had refused evacuation until every wounded soldier had been stabilized. The recommendation had been approved. The medal was in her service file. She was one of the most decorated combat nurses in the Army's record system for her rank and time of service. The officers who had shot her and then described her as a threat had never been deployed. Decker had 11 years on the force. His most serious line-of-duty incident, according to records Pratt had pulled, was a pursuit in 2019 that had ended without injury. Graves closed the file and sat for a moment in the conference room that Walter Fenwick had given them to use, the one with the bad coffee machine in the corner and the window that looked out onto the east parking lot. He thought about what he was going to say when he walked into the Calverton Police Department. Then he thought about the woman in the ICU 2 floors up, who had pressed her own hand to her own wound in a parking garage while a police officer filed a false report 15 feet away. He picked up his radio. "Pratt," he said, "get the vehicles ready. We're moving to the precinct at 0900. Sergeant Burrell came in for his shift at 8:30. He went through the morning briefing, poured coffee, checked in on the administrative leave paperwork for Decker and Price. Everything was moving the way he'd expected. The footage had been flagged, the statement was out, and the internal review would take weeks, during which time the story would either fade or be managed. He'd seen it before. The first 24 hours were the window. If you controlled the first 24 hours, you controlled the narrative. He was in his office reviewing call logs when his desk phone rang. The officer at the front desk told him there were military vehicles outside. Burrell stood up and looked out his window. There were 2 Army green utility vehicles parked along the curb, and 4 uniformed figures were walking toward the front entrance. The one in the lead was a lieutenant colonel, tall and unhurried, with the stride of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to end. Burrell's phone rang again before he could process what he was seeing. It was the precinct commander, Captain Leonard Voigt. "Burrell," Voigt said, "get to the conference room, right now." Burrell walked down the hall. He pushed open the conference room door. Lieutenant Colonel Graves was already inside, seated at the head of the table. Warrant Officer Pratt was at the side wall with a laptop open. Staff Sergeant Hollis was standing near the door. Captain Sue had her legal pad and was not looking at Burrell with any particular warmth. The hospital's backup footage was paused on a screen at the front of the room. Graves looked at Burrell when he entered. "Sit down, Sergeant," he said. It was a very specific tone, not aggressive, not loud, but with the particular weight of someone who has all the information he needs and is offering the other person one final opportunity to understand the situation they're in. Burrell sat. Graves picked up a folder. "The footage you marked corrupted," he said, "wasn't the only copy." He opened the folder and placed a still image on the table, a frame captured from the hospital's backup system, time-stamped 7:42 p.m., showing Mara Linfield with both hands visible, the equipment case on the ground beside her, and Decker's weapon already drawn. Harmon Medical has maintained a redundant surveillance archive since 2022. We retrieved it at 1:15 this morning. Burrell said nothing. Officer Decker's body camera, Graves continued, recorded 22 seconds of audio prior to the discharge that does not appear in the written incident report. Officer Price's camera recorded something similar. He placed a transcript on the table. The dispatch log from the original call makes no mention of a weapon or a theft. It describes a woman in scrubs carrying a hospital bag. Another document. And the biomedical services log at Harmon Medical shows that Sergeant Mara Linfield signed out a portable defibrillator at 15:17 and returned it at 19:15, 27 minutes before she was shot. The room was quiet. Burrell looked at the still image on the table. He looked at the transcript. He looked at the window. Graves leaned forward slightly. "The question I have for you right now," he said, "is not about what Decker and Price did in that parking garage. That's already documented. The question is about who accessed the evidence file between 8:00 and 8:45 p.m. last night and what the reason was." He paused. "Because right now that access log has your credentials on it." The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then Burrell said something that wasn't a denial. It was the kind of thing people said when they'd convinced themselves that what they were doing was containment rather than obstruction, that they were protecting something larger, some idea of institutional stability, some version of order that required certain things to stay buried. He said something about the process, about the review, about how these things were handled internally. Graves listened to all of it without interrupting. When Burrell finished, Graves closed the folder. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "you didn't contain anything. You handed us the evidence that there was something worth containing." He stood. Outside the conference room window, one of the Army utility vehicles had pulled to the side entrance. Burrell looked at it and understood, for the first time since he had walked into this room, that the 24-hour window he'd been counting on had already closed. Graves picked up his radio. Pratt was already moving toward the door. And somewhere in the ICU on the 3rd floor of Harmon Medical Center, Mara Linfield was awake, staring at the ceiling, running numbers in her head, blood loss, recovery timeline, the precise sequence of events in that parking garage, and waiting for the part that came next. She had been here before. Not in a hospital bed, not exactly like this, but in the specific position of being the person in the room that everyone had underestimated, waiting for the moment when the record would speak for itself. She had learned, over 9 years and 3 deployments and more close calls than she liked to count, that the truth was slow. It moved through systems and paperwork and the careful, unglamorous work of people who believed it was worth their time. But it moved. It always moved. And in a precinct conference room 2 miles away, it was already in motion, documented, time-stamped, and sitting on a table in front of the man who had made the mistake of shooting her. The truth moved, but it didn't move quietly. By 9 o'clock that morning, word had spread through the Calverton Police Department the way bad news always does in closed institutions. Not through official channels, but through the particular nervous energy of people who sensed that something structural was shifting beneath them. Officers who had nothing to do with the parking garage incident were suddenly very interested in their phones. Conversations in the break room stopped when the wrong person walked in. The front desk officer who had called Burrell about the military vehicles outside had repeated the story 3 times before his shift was an hour old, each retelling adding detail, losing accuracy, and arriving at something that was more feeling than fact but wasn't entirely wrong either. The feeling was, something is here that doesn't usually come here, and it's not leaving. Inside the conference room, Graves had asked Burrell to remain while Hollis stepped out to make 2 calls. One to Fort Caldwell's JAG office confirming the evidentiary chain of custody, and one to the Federal Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western Kentucky District. That second call was the one that mattered. It was the one that would determine whether what happened next was a military administrative matter or something considerably more serious. Burrell sat at the table. He had not called a lawyer yet. That fact alone told Graves something. Captain Voigt arrived 12 minutes after the Army team had entered the building. He was a compact man in his early 50s with a methodical manner that Graves recognized as the product of someone who had learned, over a long career, that reacting too quickly to things was usually the mistake. Voigt walked into the conference room, read the room in about 4 seconds, and did not offer his hand. "What's the status here?" he asked Graves. "We're documenting," Graves said. "On whose authority?" "The Army's investigative authority in matters involving an active service record holder and pending notification from the Federal Civil Rights Division, potentially theirs as well." Graves held Voigt's gaze. "Sergeant Linfield carries a classified service designation. The protocol was triggered when she was admitted. This isn't optional, Captain." Voigt looked at Burrell. Something passed between them. Not a signal, exactly, but the particular discomfort of 2 men realizing they were in a room where the usual rules of jurisdiction no longer applied in the way they expected. "I want to see the documentation," Voigt said. Graves set the folder on the table and opened it. Voigt read. He read the body camera transcript. He read the dispatch log. He looked at the still image from the hospital's backup feed. Mara Linfield with her hands visible, the case on the ground, Decker's weapon already raised. And something in his face changed, not dramatically, not the way a man breaks in a movie, more the way a calculation shifts when a variable turns out to be different than what was assumed. "The internal review was already initiated," Voigt said, but it came out softer than he'd meant it to. "Your internal review used an evidence file that had been tampered with," Graves said. "That changes what kind of review it is." Voigt set the transcript down. He looked at Burrell. Burrell was staring at the table. Voigt said, "I need to make a call." "Of course," Graves said. "We're not leaving." 2 miles away, Mara was arguing with a resident. The resident, young, earnest, the specific kind of tired that came from a 30-hour shift rather than a lifetime of it, had come in to check her drain output and had made the mistake of telling her that Dr. Okafor wouldn't be available until rounds at 10. "I understand rounds at 10, Mara said. "I'm asking about the imaging from last night. I want to see the post-op report." "That's really something Dr. Okafor should go through with you. I've read post-op reports before. I've written them." She watched his expression. "I'm not going to do anything with it. I just need to understand what's in there." He hesitated. He was going to say no. She could see him building toward it. I know how recovery looks when it's going well and when it isn't, she said, quieter. I've been doing this long enough. I'm not asking so I can panic. I'm asking so I can think straight. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled up the report on the tablet and set it where she could see it. She read it without touching it. The lower wound repair was clean. Okafor had gotten the intestinal nick in one suture line, no secondary bleeds. The drain was precautionary. The shoulder was going to be the longer problem. The bullet had passed through the deltoid and nicked the posterior glenoid, which meant range of motion recovery was going to take work, and she was going to need physical therapy. She didn't currently have the patience to think about. She handed the tablet back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, surprised she'd let it go that quickly. What she didn't tell him was that she'd already cataloged the recovery timeline in the back of her mind. 6 to 8 weeks for the abdominal wound, 3 to 4 months minimum before the shoulder was functional enough for clinical work. The math of it sat in her chest like something heavy. She was the only person in Harmon's ED who ran the overnight trauma rotation with both the surgical and field triage certifications. Coverage was going to be a problem. It was a strange thing to be thinking about, she knew that. She had been shot less than 12 hours ago. She was in an ICU bed with a drain in her side. And she was running staffing logistics in her head because that was the thing she could control, the thing that had a sequence and a set of steps, the thing that kept the other part of the night. The parking garage, the flat sound of the shot, the concrete against her cheek, from taking up too much space right now. She had learned that trick in Afghanistan. You found the part of the situation that had a procedure, and you focused on that. You stayed in the procedure. The rest could wait. Her cell phone was on the bedside table. The charge nurse had retrieved it from her locker downstairs after surgery. Mara looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up and called the one person who might already know what was happening before she had to explain it. The phone rang twice. Linfield. The voice on the other end was careful, contained, the sound of someone who had been awake for a long time and was managing it. I heard. I've been waiting for you to call. Master Sergeant Dolores Whitman, retired, now doing private security consulting out of Nashville, had been Mara's senior NCO during the first deployment. She was one of about 4 people on the planet whose call Mara would always pick up, and one of 2 whose judgment she trusted without reservation. How bad's the coverage going to be? Whitman asked, because she knew exactly how Mara's brain worked. 4 months minimum on the shoulder, Mara said. The other stuff is cleaner. You need anything right now? Not yet. Mara paused. There's a military investigative team here. LTC Graves, Fort Caldwell. A beat. Good, Whitman said, and she meant it. Yeah. You holding up? It was the kind of question that didn't require honesty, just acknowledgement. Mara considered lying, considered saying fine, considered the 12 different versions of okay that didn't cost anything. I'm working on it, she said. That's enough. A pause. Call me when you need something that's not logistics. Mara ended the call and set the phone down. Outside the ICU window, the morning was gray and still wet from last night's rain. She watched a maintenance worker push a cart across the parking lot below, unhurried, moving through the world with the specific ease of someone whose morning had gone normally. She thought about the camera on level 3. She thought about whether anyone had gotten to it yet. She thought about Decker's face, not when he fired, but the moment before, when she'd told him there was a difference between being difficult and being precise. The way his expression had flatlined into something that was less anger than a kind of confirmed contempt, as if her words had been the problem rather than the situation. She'd seen that look before. Not from cops. From certain commanders, certain administrators, certain people who had decided what category you belonged in and treated any evidence to the contrary as an inconvenience rather than information. She'd outlasted all of them. She was going to outlast this too. The U.S. Attorney's Office sent 2 federal investigators to Calverton by 11 a.m. They arrived in a gray sedan, unremarkable except for the federal credentials they showed at the precinct's front desk, and they went directly into the conference room where Graves's team had been working for the past 3 hours. The senior investigator was a woman named Reyes, 30s, quiet, with the specific economy of movement that came from years of witness interviews where reading the room mattered more than filling it. Her partner, Osei, was younger, handled the documentation, and had already pulled up the federal civil rights statute database on his laptop before he'd taken his coat off. Graves walked them through the evidence file in 40 minutes. Reyes watched the parking garage footage without comment. When it ended, she asked to see it again. She watched it a second time, this time pausing it at the moment Mara's hand moved toward the equipment case. "How long is that movement?" she asked. "0.4 seconds, Pratt said. She'd already measured it. "And she's reaching toward the case, not toward her body. The case is on her right. She's moving her right hand toward it. Decker is to her left." Reyes looked at the frame for another moment. Then she looked at the incident report. "The report says she reached for a concealed weapon," she said, not as a question. "Yes." "And the body camera audio?" Sue pulled up the transcript. She highlighted a section and turned the laptop toward Reyes. Reyes read it. The audio, recovered from Decker's body camera, included 17 seconds before the first shot that had not been included in the incident report. In those 17 seconds, Decker could be heard telling Mara to remove her jacket after she had already provided both her hospital ID and her military identification. Mara's response, "I'm being precise," was there. Decker's reply, 4 words, flat and impatient, that would not have been appropriate in any use of force context, was there too. None of it was in the written statement. "Who prepared the incident report?" Reyes asked. "Decker and Price jointly, per standard procedure," Graves said, "with review by Burrell." Reyes looked at Osei. A small, precise nod passed between them, the kind of shorthand that came from working together long enough to not need full sentences. "Where's Burrell now?" she asked. "Still in this building," Graves said. "He's been asked to remain." "Good." Reyes closed the folder. "I want to talk to Voigt." Captain Voigt, it turned out, was a more complicated figure than either Graves or Reyes had initially assessed. He was not, as far as anyone could establish, directly involved in the falsification of the incident report. His name did not appear on Burrell's access log. His communications with Decker and Price in the hours after the shooting were, on the surface, procedurally appropriate. He had placed them on administrative leave, initiated the internal review request, and notified the department's legal office. But Reyes, who had spent a decade on cases exactly like this one, recognized something in Voigt that the documents didn't quite capture. The specific passivity of a man who had known things were wrong for a long time and had made a sustained, careful effort not to know them officially. She found this out about 30 minutes into their conversation when she asked him about prior complaints against Decker. Voigt said there were none on file that he was aware of. Osei pulled up a document. There were 3. 2 formal complaints filed in the past 4 years, 1 excessive force, 1 conduct unbecoming, and 1 informal complaint from a detective in the precinct's own investigative unit that had been filed 14 months ago and assigned to Burrell for review. Burrell had marked it inconclusive. The documentation trail ended there. Voigt looked at the document. "I wasn't briefed on the informal complaint," he said. "Were you briefed on the formal ones?" A pause. "One of them," he said. Reyes did not change her expression. She wrote something on her legal pad, slowly, deliberately, the kind of writing that was meant to be seen, and then looked up. "Captain," she said, "I want to give you an opportunity to be straightforward with me about the department's handling of prior conduct issues with Officer Decker, because what I'm looking at right now suggests a pattern. And a pattern means this isn't an isolated incident. And if it isn't isolated, then the question of institutional knowledge becomes very important." She paused. "You understand what I mean by that?" Voigt understood. I was quiet for nearly 10 seconds. Then he said, "I need to speak with legal counsel before we go further." "Of course," Reyes said. "That's your right." She stood, gathered her documents. "We'll be here." She walked out of the room with Osei, and as soon as the door closed, she stopped in the hallway and said quietly, "Get the full department personnel file. Decker, Price, Burrell, and anything that touched those 3 complaints." "Already requested," Osei said. They walked back toward the conference room. Behind them, through the closed door, there was silence. Dr. Okafor came in at 10:15, 20 minutes behind schedule, because trauma surgery didn't run on schedules, and spent 40 minutes with Mara going through the post-op report line by line. Okafor was direct and detailed in the way that good surgeons usually were, presenting information without softening it or over-explaining, which Mara appreciated. The drain comes out in 48 hours if output stays where it is, Okafor said. The abdominal wound should be weight-bearing in 3 weeks. The shoulder is a longer conversation, and you're going to need to have it with orthopedics. I know, Mara said. How's your pain level? Manageable. Okafor looked at her. Physicians looked at patients who gave answers that were technically true but contextually optimistic. On a scale, 6, Mara said. I'm not going to say 4. Thank you for that. Okafor made a note. I'm adjusting the analgesic schedule. You don't have to be stoic about this. I'm not being stoic. 6 is accurate. Okay. Okafor clicked the pen closed. There's a lieutenant colonel outside who'd like to speak with you when you're ready. He's been here since last night. Mara had been expecting this. Send him in, she said. Graves came in alone. He pulled the chair to her bedside and sat without preamble, which she respected. He was tall, measured, with the kind of face that had processed a lot of information over a lot of years and had gotten good at keeping most of it internal. He looked at her the way someone looked at a person they'd read the full file on and were now reconciling with the actual human being in front of them. Sergeant Linfield, he said. I'm not active anymore, she said. Mara's fine. He nodded. Darnell Graves. I command the 4th MPIU out of Caldwell. I know who you are. The duty officer flag triggered a notification to my emergency contact too. She called me at 6. She adjusted slightly, careful of the drain. What do you have? He told her. Not everything. Some of it was still moving through the evidence chain. But enough. The backup footage. The body camera audio. The dispatch log. Burrell's access to the evidence file. The federal investigators who had arrived at 11 and were currently in the precinct working through the department's personnel records. Mara listened without interrupting. She had the habit, developed over years of trauma assessments, of not responding until she had a complete picture, because responding to incomplete information was how you made errors, and errors had consequences. When Graves finished, she was quiet for a moment. The 3 prior complaints against Decker, she said. Do you know what they involved specifically? 1 excessive force during a traffic stop. 1 conduct unbecoming toward a detainee. The informal complaint is still being pulled. Burrell marked it inconclusive 14 months ago, and the trail goes cold. That's 3 years of documentation, she said. 3 years of someone at the department knowing Decker had a problem and choosing not to escalate it. Yes. Which means last night wasn't an accident. Graves held her gaze. It means it wasn't unpredictable. That distinction mattered. Mara understood it immediately. An accident was a failure of circumstance. What she was describing was a failure of system, one that had created the conditions for what happened in that parking garage long before she had parked on level 3. What do you need from me? She asked. A formal statement when you're medically able. The hospital is already cooperating with evidence preservation. The federal investigators will want to speak with you directly. He paused. There's one other thing. What? Your service record is going to become part of the federal case file, he said. The classified portions will stay sealed, but the commendations, the deployments, the Bronze Star recommendation, those will be disclosed in proceedings. I wanted you to know that before it happened. Mara looked at the window for a moment. She had kept the Bronze Star in a drawer for 3 years. She hadn't thought about it much. Awards felt abstract after the fact. They were given for moments that had, in the moment, felt like necessity, rather than heroism, because when 11 people needed to not die, you did the work, and the terminology was somebody else's concern. That's fine, she said. Some of it will become public if this goes to federal prosecution, Graves added. I know how federal cases work, she said. It came out a little sharper than she meant it to. She softened it. It's fine, use what you need. Graves nodded. He stood. One more thing, she said. He stopped. The attendant who filed the original call, she said. Cody. What was his actual reason? Graves paused, and that pause told her the answer was something specific rather than something vague. He has a history of complaints against the hospital's security staff. We think the call was retaliatory for an unrelated dispute. Mara absorbed this. A man she had never met had filed a false report out of a grievance that had nothing to do with her, and because of that report, 2 officers who were already known to be problems had been handed an opportunity. It was not the most complicated sequence of events she had ever encountered. It was not even particularly unusual. What it was the specific way that systems failed. Not all at once, but through accumulation, through small permissions given and small consequences avoided, until the day when everything that should have been caught wasn't, and someone was on the floor of a parking garage pressing their own hand to a wound. "Okay," she said. Graves left. Mara looked at the ceiling. She thought about the 11 soldiers from the convoy ambush. She thought about the way the field had looked that afternoon. The specific light, the dust, the sound of someone telling her she needed to evacuate, and her telling them she wasn't finished yet. She hadn't finished. She'd stayed until every one of them was stable. Then she'd let them take her. She'd spent years not thinking about it as remarkable. It was the job. You did the job. But now she lay in a hospital bed that should have been unnecessary, in a body that had been through 3 hours of surgery because 2 officers with a documented record of misconduct had been allowed to remain armed and on the street, and she thought about all the files that had been marked inconclusive, all the complaints that had stopped somewhere in the chain, all the moments when someone could have changed the trajectory and had chosen not to. And she thought about what it meant that an Army lieutenant colonel had shown up with federal investigators and a full evidence file in less than 12 hours. It meant that the people who had tried to contain last night in the first 24 hours had miscalculated badly. It meant the record was talking, and somewhere across town, in a precinct conference room with a still image of her on a table and a personnel file being dismantled by federal investigators, the people who had shot her and then lied about it were beginning to understand what they had actually done. Reyes found the 3rd complaint at 2 p.m. It had been filed by a retired detective named Sandra Voss, who had worked in the Calverton PD's investigative unit for 18 years before taking a medical retirement. Voss had submitted the informal complaint against Decker 14 months ago, after witnessing him use language during a suspect processing that she described, in careful and specific terms, as degrading and racially motivated. Burrell had reviewed it. He had interviewed Decker. He had interviewed 2 officers who had also been present. All 3 said the same thing. Voss had misheard. It was a stressful situation. Decker had been frustrated, not hostile. Burrell had marked it inconclusive. What Reyes found, buried in the administrative folder attached to the case, was a note that should not have been there. A brief typed memo, unsigned, recommending that the complaint not be escalated, given the complainant's pending medical separation and the lack of corroborating witnesses. The memo was dated 3 days after Burrell's interview with Decker. It was written on Voight's letterhead. Reyes read it twice. She set it down. She looked at Osei. "Get me Voight's legal counsel contact," she said, "and pull his full personnel history." She paused. "And get me Sandra Voss's contact information." Osei was already typing. The clock on the conference room wall read 2:08 p.m. By 2:45, Reyes would have Sandra Voss on the phone, and Voss, who had been waiting 14 months for someone to take her call, would not be brief. By 4 p.m., the evidence file would have expanded from a single incident to something that was going to take weeks to fully document, something that connected a parking garage on Delacroix Avenue to a pattern that stretched back at least 4 years. And by 4:30, a hospital administrator named Walter Fenwick would receive a call from the department's public information office, requesting that Harmon Medical Center hold any public statements about the incident pending an ongoing federal investigation. Fenwick would agree. Then he would hang up, walk down the hall to his office, close the door, and call the hospital's legal team, because he had been in administration long enough to know that when federal investigators asked you to hold statements, the next thing that usually happened was that the story got bigger, not smaller. He was right. What none of them knew yet, not Graves, not Reyes, not Fenwick, not the officers sitting in the precinct waiting to see how the internal review would land, was that Sandra Voss had done something 14 months ago that she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She had kept her own copy of the Decker interview recording. She had kept it because she'd known, the moment Burrell handed her back the inconclusive ruling, that it wasn't over. She'd worked investigations for 18 years. She knew what a protected officer looked like. She knew what it looked like when the paperwork was shaped to reach a predetermined conclusion. So she'd kept the file. She'd kept it on an encrypted drive in her home office, labeled with a date and a case number that matched nothing in Burrell's official records, and she had never mentioned it because no one had asked. Until today. Reyes was still on the phone with her when Voss said carefully, "I want you to understand, I didn't do this to cause problems. I did it because I thought someone might eventually need it." Reyes held the phone very still. "What's on the recording?" she asked. Voss told her. And as she listened, the case that had started in a parking garage on a rainy Tuesday evening became something else entirely, something that was going to reach further up the chain of the Calverton Police Department than anyone in that building had yet begun to prepare for. The recording lasted 22 minutes and 14 seconds. Reyes listened to the whole thing without interrupting, without writing notes, without doing anything except holding the phone and absorbing what Sandra Voss had kept locked on an encrypted drive for 14 months. When it ended, she sat with the silence for a moment, the way you did when something landed harder than expected, and you needed a second before your professional instincts caught back up to you. Then she said, "Ms. Voss, I need you to bring that drive to a federal evidence intake officer today. I'm going to text you an address. Don't copy it, don't email it to anyone, don't tell anyone you're coming except the person driving you." "I wasn't planning to," Voss said. She sounded tired in the specific way of someone who had been right about something for a long time and had found the experience exhausting rather than satisfying. "How long have you had it?" "Since the day Burrell handed me the inconclusive ruling. I walked out of his office, drove home, and made a copy of the interview file before I returned the department recorder." She paused. "I knew he'd close it. I could tell from the way he asked the questions. Not like he was trying to find something, like he was trying to confirm he hadn't found anything." "Did you tell anyone at the time?" "I told my husband. That's it." "Okay." Reyes was already on her feet, pulling her coat off the back of the chair. "I'll have someone meet you at the intake office. His name is Osi. Tell him I sent you." She ended the call. Osi was already looking at her from across the room. "The Decker interview," she said. "Voss recorded it herself. She kept the copy." She grabbed her bag. "The recording has Burrell coaching Decker's responses in real time, feeding him language, redirecting answers. It's not an investigation. It's a rehearsal." "Where are the two officers who witnessed the original incident Voss complained about?" he asked. "Still on the force," she said. "Pull their files. Both of them." She walked out into the hallway, and for the first time since arriving at the Calverton precinct that morning, her pace had changed. Not hurried exactly, but with the forward momentum of someone who had just watched a case reorganize itself around a new center of gravity. What had been a shooting was now a conspiracy. What had been one officer with a conduct problem was now a department with a protection system. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was a woman in a hospital bed who had pressed her own hand to a wound and waited for the record to speak. The record was speaking now, Shaq. At 3 p.m, two things happened within minutes of each other. The first was that Mara's drain output came back within normal range, which meant Dr. Okafor would pull it the following morning rather than waiting the full 48 hours, which was small but material progress. The second was that a local news van parked across the street from Harmon Medical Center and a reporter Mara didn't recognize appeared on the lobby television doing a segment about an unnamed Army veteran who had been shot by Calverton police in the hospital's parking garage. Mara watched about 45 seconds of it before the charge nurse changed the channel, which Mara did not ask her to undo. The story was thin. Whoever had briefed the reporter had either not had access to the full evidence or had been careful about what they shared, because the segment was heavy on procedural language and light on specifics. The department's public statement was quoted. Unnamed sources described an ongoing review. There was a shot of the parking garage exterior, yellow tape across the entrance to Level 3, and a graphic that said Harmon Medical Shooting, Federal Investigators Involved. That last part was new. Someone had leaked the federal involvement. Mara thought about that for a moment. It could have come from the hospital, from the precinct, from any of the dozen people who now knew that the U.S. Attorney's Office had investigators inside the Calverton PD. Leaks at this stage weren't necessarily strategic. Sometimes they were just the product of anxiety, of people who could feel the walls shifting and said something to the wrong person. But sometimes they were deliberate. She picked up her phone and called Graves. He answered on the second ring. "The news segment," she said. "I saw it," he said. "We're looking at where it came from. It doesn't change the evidence chain." "I know. I'm not worried about the evidence." She paused. "I'm worried about what Voight does when the case goes public before he's had time to talk to his counsel." There was a brief silence. "That's a reasonable concern," Graves said. "If he thinks the story is going to break fully before any deal is on the table, he might decide that controlled cooperation is less valuable than he thought." She'd watched enough field situations deteriorate because of timing. A well-positioned person who felt cornered didn't always make rational decisions. Is Reyes aware? I'll call her now. Good. She set the phone down. The afternoon light through the ICU window was the flat gray of late winter, not quite dark, but not generous either. Her shoulder ached at a persistent 7 she was rounding down to 6 out of stubbornness. The abdominal drain pulled slightly every time she shifted, which she was trying to do as little as possible. She thought about Voight. She thought about the note written on Voight's letterhead that had been buried in a complaint file, the one that had recommended against escalation based on Voss's pending medical separation. She had not seen the note herself, but Graves had described it, and the specifics of it sat in her mind with a clinical weight. Someone had made a calculation. Not an angry one, not a vindictive one. A careful administrative calculation about how to make a problem disappear without generating more paperwork than it solved. That was usually how it worked. Not dramatically, not conspiratorially, just a series of small decisions made by people who told themselves they were managing a situation that accumulated into a system that protected the wrong things. And the system had held for 4 years until last Tuesday at 7:42 p.m. on level 3 of a parking structure, when it had met someone it didn't account for. Reyes got to Voight's attorney at 3:45 p.m. The attorney, a civil litigator named Marcus Ellard, who had represented the Calverton PD on 2 prior excessive force settlements, called Reyes's office line rather than her cell, which told her he was being deliberate about the communication record. She took the call at the precinct, standing in the doorway of the conference room with Osei 3 feet away. "My client is prepared to cooperate with the federal investigation," Ellard said. "He wants to make clear that his role in any document management decisions was administrative and not directed at concealing criminal conduct." Reyes let that sit for a moment. "That's an interesting framing," she said. "It's an accurate one." "Counselor, I have a memo written on your client's letterhead recommending that a conduct complaint be suppressed based on the complainant's medical separation status. I have a recorded interview in which the investigating sergeant coached the subject officer's responses. And I have 4 years of personnel documentation that suggests a pattern of protected misconduct." She paused. "Your client's framing is going to need to be more specific than administrative." A pause on the other end. "When can we meet?" Ellard asked. "Tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock. And I want your client there." She ended the call. Osei said, "Voss is at the intake office. The drive is being processed." "Good." She looked at the clock. "Get me the 2 officers who witnessed the original Decker incident. I want to know which precinct they're currently assigned to and whether either of them has been on leave in the last 2 weeks. "Why the last 2 weeks?" "Because the news segment aired 3 hours ago, and if Voight is smart, he's already made calls. I want to know who's in a position to be told what to say before we get to them." Osei pulled out his phone. Reyes walked to the window. The afternoon had gone cold, and the street below the precinct was quiet. Just ordinary traffic, people running ordinary errands. The unremarkable texture of a Tuesday that had not been Tuesday for everyone. She thought about what Voss had described on the recording. The specific way Burrell had moved through the interview, redirecting, reframing, offering Decker language that was technically Decker's account, but had clearly been shaped in advance. She'd seen that technique before. It was used by lawyers, sometimes by investigators who had decided the outcome before the process. It required a certain confidence. The confidence that no one was going to look hard enough to find the seams. That confidence had been well-founded for 4 years. It wasn't well-founded now. The drive arrived at the Federal Evidence Processing Office at 4:22 p.m. and was signed into chain of custody by a clerk who processed it the same way she processed everything, methodically, without particular urgency, because she did not yet know what was on it. By 6 p.m., the audio files had been transferred to Reyes's evidence folder, and a forensic technician had confirmed the recording's metadata. It was made on a department-issue recorder 14 months ago, on the date of Voss's formal complaint review. The file had not been altered since the day it was created. The chain of custody was intact from the moment Voss walked out of Burrell's office to the moment it arrived in federal hands. Graves was in the conference room when Reyes brought the confirmation through. He read the forensic summary and set it down without expression, which Mara would have recognized had she been in the room, as the look of someone adding a significant piece to a picture that was already large. 22 minutes, he said, and Burrell tells him exactly what to say. Verbatim in some places, Reyes confirmed. There are at least 6 exchanges where Decker starts to answer, and Burrell interrupts him with a different framing. Decker takes the framing every time. He knew he was being protected. He'd been protected before. The formal complaints never went anywhere. He knew the process. She sat down. The question now is how far up this goes beyond Voigt. Graves looked at her. Voigt's attorney called, she said. Cooperation posture. He's trying to frame his client's role as administrative. Is it? The memo is on his letterhead. Whether he drafted it or approved it or just allowed it to be sent under his name, it's his name on it. She folded her hands on the table. I think Voigt knew. I think he made a choice about what kind of captain he was going to be. And he chose the version that didn't create problems for his command. That's different from orchestrating it, but it's not innocence. Graves was quiet for a moment. Mara called me this afternoon, he said. She was worried about Voigt acting before the story controlled him. Reyes nodded. She was right to be. Ellard called 2 hours after the news segment. She's good at reading the sequence, Graves said. It wasn't admiration exactly, more a kind of precise recognition. She was doing triage analysis from her ICU bed. Read her file? Reyes asked. I did. Reyes said, then you understand what they did in that parking garage. A pause. Yeah, Graves said. I do. Yeah. What happened at 7 p.m. was not something anyone had anticipated. The 2 officers who had witnessed the original Decker incident, Patrolman Gary Sett and Corporal Diane Rowe, had both been on duty that afternoon. OSE had flagged their personnel files and noted that neither had been placed on any kind of administrative hold. They were ordinary active duty officers, and they had presumably gone home at the end of their shifts. Except Sepp Sett hadn't gone home. He had driven to the Calverton Federal Courthouse and, without calling ahead, without a lawyer, without any apparent coordination with Reyes or anyone in the U.S. Attorney's Office, walked up to the information desk and asked to speak with a federal investigator about the Harmon medical incident. The desk officer called Reyes. She was in her car, heading back toward the federal office to review the Voss recording. She made a U-turn. Sett was waiting in a small conference room adjacent to the public lobby when she arrived. He was 41, broad through the shoulders, with the look of a man who hadn't slept recently. He was still in his uniform. He had his hands flat on the table in front of him, and he was staring at them when Reyes walked in. She sat down across from him. She didn't say anything immediately, which was a technique she'd found more useful than opening with a question. Sett looked up. I heard the news segment, he said. I knew it was going to come out. What was going to come out, she asked. What happened in the processing room with Decker? He exhaled. I know Burrell marked it inconclusive. I know that's what the file says. He paused. But I was there. I heard what Decker said. Voss reported it accurately. Reyes kept her face neutral. And you didn't support her account at the time, she said. Sett looked back at his hands. Burrell interviewed me the day after. He came in with the questions already formed. He said, not directly, not anything you could report, but he made it very clear that the investigation was going to conclude that there was insufficient corroboration and that anyone whose account differed from the official record was going to have a complicated career. He stopped. I have a family. 2 kids. I was 3 years from a pension. Reyes said nothing. I know how that sounds, he said. How does it sound? He met her eyes. Like a man who made the wrong choice for the right reasons and has been sitting with it ever since. His jaw tightened. I didn't shoot anyone, but I could have stopped what happened to that woman last Tuesday if Decker had been removed from the force 14 months ago, and he would have been if I'd told the truth. He stopped again. So I'm here. The room was very quiet. Reyes took out her legal pad. I need you to tell me everything, she said. From the beginning. The processing room incident, the Burrell interview, anything Decker or Price said to you in the 14 months between then and last Tuesday. She clicked her pen. All of it. He told her. It took an hour and 40 minutes. By the time Sett finished, it was nearly 9 o'clock. Reyes had filled 11 pages. OSE, who had arrived 20 minutes into the session, had added 6 more. The picture that emerged was not simply the story of a protected officer. It was the story of a department culture that had calcified around certain assumptions about who got consequences and who didn't, enforced through the kind of indirect pressure that left no fingerprints but was no less real for that. Set described two other incidents involving Decker that had never been formally reported, not because witnesses hadn't seen them, but because by the time of the second incident, the message from Burrell's handling of the Voss complaint had already been received and understood. Don't report, or if you report, report to someone who will make it inconclusive. The system didn't require orders. It required only the consistent demonstration that reporting had costs and silence had none. And for 4 years, that demonstration had been consistent. Until last Tuesday. Reyes walked out of the conference room at 9:15. She called Graves. Set came in voluntarily, she said. He gave a full statement. 2 additional incidents with Decker, unrecorded, confirms the Burrell interview was compromised. She paused on the sidewalk outside the courthouse, the night air sharp and cold. I need to move on Decker and Price tomorrow. Not the internal review. Federal charges. Unlawful use of force, civil rights violations, and falsification of federal records. The U.S. Attorney is ready? Graves asked. I briefed her at 6. She's ready. Reyes looked up at the courthouse building. I also want to look at Burrell for obstruction and conspiracy. The Voss recording plus Set's statement is enough to support a grand jury referral. And Voight? His attorney is coming in at 8, depending on what he gives us. We'll see. She paused. Mara needs to know we're moving tomorrow. She should hear it from you before she hears it from a news segment. I'll call her tonight. Reyes ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the case file expanding in her mind. The evidence, the recordings, the chain of decisions that had led from a processing room 14 months ago to a parking garage last Tuesday. She thought about Set sitting at that table with his hands flat and his jaw tight, describing the specific mechanics of how he had been made to be quiet. And she thought about the particular courage it took to walk into a courthouse without a lawyer and say, I was wrong, and here's what I know. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened. But it was something. Well, Graves called Mara at 9:40. She was awake. The floor had been quiet for the last hour, the particular late-night stillness of an ICU where nothing was actively going wrong, and she had been doing the things she did when she couldn't sleep in places she was supposed to be still. Running scenarios, cataloging information, holding the shape of events in her mind and turning them to find the angle she hadn't looked at yet. Graves told her about Set, about the federal charge timeline, about Reyes and the U.S. Attorney moving to grand jury referral for Burrell. She listened. Voight's attorney is meeting at 8 tomorrow, she said when he finished. Yes. He's going to offer something. He's calculating that partial cooperation is better than the alternative. Probably. What does Reyes need from me before she moves? Your formal statement. They'd like to come to the hospital tomorrow afternoon if you're medically cleared for an interview. Mara thought about her drain output, her pain level, the orthopedic consult that was scheduled for 10 a.m. None of it was relevant. I'll be cleared, she said. Graves said, get some sleep. I'll work on it, she said, which was honest in the way that 6 is honest when 7 is what you feel, but 6 is what you can manage. She set the phone down. The ICU was quiet. The monitor beside her tracked her pulse in small green peaks, steady, unhurried, the stubborn persistence of a body that had been through considerably worse and had declined to stop. She thought about Set, a man who had made the wrong call 14 months ago and had been carrying it since, and who had walked into a courthouse because he could not, in the end, let the wrong call stand on top of another wrong call, on top of what had been done to her in that parking garage. She didn't feel forgiving about him. She wasn't sure forgiveness was hers to give, but she understood him, which was different, and she understood what it cost to walk through that door. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed with a text from Whitman. News says federal charges tomorrow. You doing okay? She typed back, working on it. Whitman replied with a single word, good. Mara set the phone down, closed her eyes, and was finally, after nearly 20 hours of forcing her body to stillness, beginning to approach something close to sleep when the ICU monitor at the nurse's station made a sound she recognized. She opened her eyes. Through the glass partition, she could see the night nurse moving quickly toward a room 2 doors down. Another nurse appeared from the break room, already moving. The specific, focused urgency of clinical staff responding to a patient in distress. It wasn't her. But she was fully awake now, her body answering the stimulus the way 9 years of training had hardwired it to. Alert, precise, scanning. She lay still. She listened to the sounds of the floor working, and she was still listening when, 20 minutes later, something else happened. Something that had nothing to do with the patient 2 doors down and everything to do with a call that came through to the Harmon Medical Center's main security desk at 10:17 p.m. from an unlisted number requesting the room number of a patient named Mara Linfield. The security officer at the desk, following protocol, declined to provide patient room information. But she noted the call, and when she cross-referenced it with the security log, she found that it was the second call in 3 hours requesting the same information. The first had come at 7:44 p.m., 11 minutes after the news segment aired. Neither call had identified the caller. The security officer escalated it to the night supervisor, who escalated it to the hospital's on-call administrator, who, because Walter Fenwick had given very specific instructions about anything related to this patient before going home that evening, called Fenwick directly. Fenwick called Graves at 10:31 p.m. Graves was already dressed when the call came in. He had not, in fact, gone to sleep. He called Pratt. "Level 3, he said. "Now." Pratt was moving before he finished the sentence because she had read the same files he had, and she understood exactly what 2 calls to a hospital security desk from an unlisted number requesting a patient's room meant when that patient was in the middle of a federal investigation into a police department that had a demonstrated history of suppressing inconvenient information. It meant someone knew Mara was still a problem, and someone was trying to figure out where she was. Graves arrived at Harmon Medical Center at 10:58 p.m. with Pratt and Hollis, and the 3 of them moved through the lobby with the kind of speed that made the night security guard stand up before they reached his desk. Fenwick was already in the building. He met them at the elevator bank with the on-call security director, a heavy-set man named Orville Tatum, who had the look of someone who had been woken up and had not yet decided how he felt about it. Tatum had the call logs in his hand, both of them, time-stamped, the originating numbers listed as unavailable through standard trace. Graves looked at the logs. "You have a system that captures incoming call metadata?" he asked Tatum. "We do. It's attached to the main security desk line. The numbers came back unlisted through our system, but the carrier data might be different." Tatum handed over the printout. Both calls asked specifically for Linfield by name. Neither identified themselves. When the desk officer said, "We don't provide patient room information," both callers ended the call immediately. No attempt to leave a message, no follow-up question. Nothing. Graves handed the printout to Pratt, who was already photographing it. "We need a stationary post on Linfield's room," Graves said. "One of ours tonight." "Not hospital security? Ours." Tatum looked at Fenwick. Fenwick said, "Whatever you need." Hollis took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Pratt went to the security office to work the carrier metadata request through Fort Caldwell's communications unit, which had the federal access that the hospital's system didn't. Graves walked to the stairwell, took it to the 3rd floor, and went to Mara's room. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She looked at him when he came through the door and read his face the way she read everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, and said, "The calls." "Fenwick told you." "The night nurse told me. She heard the supervisor's radio." Mara shifted slightly, careful. 2 calls. Unlisted. Both within 3 hours of the news segment. "Yes." "That's not a journalist," she said. "No." She held his gaze. "Someone in the department is worried about what I can still do from a hospital bed." Graves said, "We're working the carrier data. Hollis is outside your room tonight." "I don't need a guard." "It's not about what you need," he said. "It's about what the investigation requires. You're a federal witness now. Your security matters to the case, not just to you." She didn't argue with that, which meant she understood it was true. "The federal charges? They're still moving tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes. Reyes is proceeding." Mara looked at the window. The parking lot below was mostly dark, the ordinary geography of a hospital at night. "If someone in the department was trying to locate my room, they're not acting alone. That's not how people think under pressure. They don't make calls to hospital desks on their own initiative. Someone told them to. That's what we think too. Which means someone higher up than Decker and Price is still operating. We're aware." She looked back at him. "Voight? Possibly. Or someone Voight talked to after his attorney called Reyes." Graves paused. "It could also be Burrell reaching out before the charges land. People make bad decisions when they think they're running out of time." Bad decisions like trying to locate a witness. Yes. The room was quiet for a moment. Get some sleep, Graves said again. You said that 3 hours ago, Mara told him. He left. Mara looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for another hour, running the logic of it. Who would make those calls? What they thought they would accomplish? What it told her about the state of mind inside the department right now. People who were calm and calculating didn't make calls to hospital security desks. They went quiet, they lawyered up, they waited for the process to find them. People who were panicking reached for anything that felt like control. Someone inside the Calverton PD was panicking, and panicking people made the kinds of mistakes that gave investigators exactly what they needed. The carrier metadata came back at 1:14 a.m. Pratt was still in the hospital's security office, working through Fort Caldwell's communications relay when the results appeared on her screen. She read them once, then read them again, then called Graves on his cell. Both calls originated from the same number, she said. A prepaid device purchased 3 weeks ago at a convenience store in downtown Calverton. The carrier flagged it as a burner. 3 weeks ago, Graves repeated, before the shooting. They both understood what that meant. A prepaid device bought 3 weeks before the incident was not a panicked purchase made after the news segment aired. It was a precaution taken in advance, the kind of thing you bought when you were already thinking about situations where you didn't want your regular phone to appear in a record. Who had reason to buy a burner 3 weeks ago? Graves asked. Someone who knew that whatever was about to happen might generate a federal investigation, Pratt said, or someone who was already managing communications they didn't want documented. Burrell, Graves said. That's the most likely fit given the timeline, but we can't place the purchase without store footage, and 3 weeks is long enough for it to be gone. She paused. What I can say is that the last outgoing call from that number before tonight was made 9 days ago, to a cell number that belongs to Decker. The line went quiet for a moment. Graves said, 9 days ago Decker was still on active duty. Yes. So Burrell, if it's Burrell, was in communication with Decker on an undocumented device while Decker was still carrying a badge. And then 2 calls to Harmon Medical tonight. Graves sat with this for a moment in the dark of the hospital conference room that Fenwick had made available for them. Send everything to Reyes, he said. Tonight. She needs it before the 8 o'clock meeting with Voight's counsel. Pratt was already sending it. But Reyes received the carrier data at 1:31 a.m. and read it in bed on her laptop, with the particular focused attention of someone who understood that exhaustion was a scheduling problem rather than a medical one when the situation required it. She read the timeline, the prepaid device, the call to Decker 9 days prior, the 2 calls to Harmon Medical within hours of the news segment. She got up, made coffee, and spent 45 minutes restructuring the morning's agenda. What had been a meeting about Voight's cooperation posture was now something more pointed. Because if Burrell had maintained an undocumented line of communication with Decker after the shooting, after the administrative leave, after the investigation had formally begun, then the obstruction case had just extended from the evidence tampering on the night of the incident to active interference with an ongoing federal investigation. That was no longer a question of sentencing ranges and cooperation credit. That was a second, separate criminal matter running parallel to the first. She called the U.S. attorney at 2 a.m. She did not apologize for the hour. The Burrell obstruction case is larger than we thought, she said. I need a second arrest warrant drawn up alongside the Decker and Price charges, and I need the federal magistrate available by 7. A pause on the other end. Then, send me what you have. She sent it. At 2:45 a.m., the U.S. attorney replied, Magistrate confirmed for 0700. Have the warrants ready. Reyes finished her coffee and started drafting. Morning came gray and cold. The sky over Calverton the color of old concrete, and the Calverton Police Department began its day without knowing that it was going to end differently than it started. Voight arrived at his own precinct at 7:30 in a civilian suit, which told anyone watching that he already understood today was not a police matter. Ellard, his attorney, was with him. They went directly to the conference room, which still had the Army investigative team's equipment in it, and sat down across from Reyes and Osei at 8 o'clock exactly. Ellard opened. My client is prepared to provide a full account of his awareness of prior conduct issues involving officers Decker and Price, in exchange for consideration of his cooperation in any sentencing proceedings. Reyes set a document on the table. Ellard looked at it. It was a federal warrant. Not for Voight. For Burrell. "I'm not here to negotiate Captain Voight's cooperation this morning," Reyes said. "I'm here to inform him that Sergeant Burrell is being taken into federal custody in approximately 90 minutes on charges of obstruction of justice and witness tampering, in addition to the evidence falsification charges from the night of the incident." She paused. "I'm also here to tell him that the evidence supporting those charges includes communication records from a prepaid device Burrell used to contact Officer Decker 9 days after the shooting while the investigation was active." Ellard went very still. Voight looked at the warrant and said nothing. "What that means for your client," Reyes continued, "is that the cooperation calculation has changed, because Burrell is no longer in a position to corroborate or contradict whatever account Captain Voight provides. Burrell is now a co-defendant, which means his account is compromised, and the evidentiary weight shifts entirely to what Captain Voight can document independently." She let that land. "What does my client have that's independent?" Ellard asked. His voice was careful, the voice of a man revising his strategy in real time. "The memo," Reyes said. "The one on his letterhead recommending against escalating the Voss complaint. He can explain the chain of decisions that produced that memo. Who was involved, who approved it, whether anyone above his level in the department command structure was aware of the protected conduct pattern." She looked directly at Voight. "Because right now, Captain, the evidence places you at the administration of a cover-up. What I don't yet know is whether you were the architect of it or an instrument of it. That distinction matters considerably." Voight looked at Ellard. Ellard said quietly, "Give us 10 minutes." Reyes stood, straightened her jacket, and walked out of the conference room without hurrying. In the hallway, Osei handed her a coffee. "Burrell?" he asked. "Pratt's team picks him up at 9:30. She checked her watch. "The Decker and Price warrants execute at 10. Osei nodded. "Voight's going to cooperate," she said. It wasn't a prediction exactly, more a reading, the product of watching a man's face when a document landed in front of him and understanding what he was calculating. He's not protecting the institution anymore. He's protecting himself. And to protect himself, he needs to show that the institution failed, not him specifically. Which means he gives us whoever's above him. If there's anyone above him. Is there? Reyes drank her coffee. 14 months of protected misconduct in a mid-sized city department doesn't survive on one captain's goodwill alone, she said. Someone else looked at those complaint files. Someone else signed off on personnel reviews. I want to know who reviewed Decker's use of force training renewal last year, because an officer with 2 formal conduct complaints on record should not have cleared that renewal without a flag, Osei was writing. And I want the name of whoever approved Burrell's inconclusive ruling on the Voss complaint, she added, because Burrell marked it inconclusive, but someone with oversight authority accepted that marking without question. That's not nothing. She finished the coffee. The conference room door opened. Ellard stepped out. My client will cooperate fully, he said. He wants to begin this morning. Reyes looked at him. Good, she said. At 9:28 a.m., Graves's team went to Burrell's home address in the east side of Calverton. Burrell answered the door in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray pullover, the look of a man who had not slept. He saw Pratt first, then Hollis behind her, and then the federal arrest warrant in Pratt's hand, and something in his face did the specific arithmetic of a person who had been running calculations for 48 hours and had arrived, finally, at the wrong answer. He didn't argue. He didn't say anything, in fact, until Pratt was walking him to the vehicle, at which point he stopped on his own front walkway and said, quietly, to no one in particular, I thought it would stay contained. Pratt said, it didn't. He got in the vehicle. The Decker and Price warrants executed at 10:04 a.m. Decker was at home. He had been on administrative leave since the night of the shooting and had, by the account of his neighbors, not left the house in 2 days. He came to the door when federal officers knocked, looked at the warrant, and asked to call his attorney. He was told he could do that at the federal processing facility. He said nothing else. Price was harder to locate. He had not been at his registered address since the previous evening, a fact that the federal investigators discovered when they arrived at his apartment building, and his neighbor mentioned, unprompted, that she had seen him loading bags into his car around 9 o'clock the night before. Osei flagged it immediately. 9 o'clock the previous evening was approximately 40 minutes after the news segment had aired. He was watching the news, Osei said. And he ran, Reyes said. Abolo went out through federal channels at 10:22 a.m. Price's vehicle description, his cell number for tower pings, his known associates and family contacts in the region. The search was not dramatic. It was paperwork and phone calls and the methodical work of people who did this routinely, but it had a weight to it because a law enforcement officer fleeing a federal warrant was not a small thing, and the story that it told about Price's understanding of his own culpability was the clearest statement he could have made. Reyes called Graves. Price ran, she said. A pause. How long of a head start? Graves asked. 12 hours if he left at 9 last night, maybe less. She was looking at the map on Osei's laptop, tracking the cell tower pings already coming in from Price's carrier. He used his phone at 11:15 last night. Tower places him 60 miles east of Calverton, on the interstate. He's not going far, Graves said. No, he doesn't have the resources or the plan for far. She zoomed out on the map. He's panicking, same as whoever made those calls to the hospital last night. Any connection between Price and those calls? Still working it. The burner phone is Burrell's most likely, but we can't rule out that Price was told to make contact. She paused. Either way, it doesn't matter much now. He ran. That's its own statement. Mara's formal statement was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Reyes arrived at the hospital at 1:45, accompanied by Osei, and Graves was already in the hallway outside Mara's room when they got there. The orthopedic consult had concluded at noon with a recovery plan that Mara had already begun mentally restructuring into a timeline she found more acceptable than the one the orthopedist had outlined. The drain had been removed that morning. She was still in pain in the specific way of someone who had chosen accuracy over comfort in describing it, but she was sitting upright and her eyes were clear. Reyes sat in the chair beside the bed. She had done a lot of witness interviews. She had done them in hospitals before, with victims of violent crimes, with people in various stages of physical and psychological recovery, with people who were angry and people who were shut down, and people who were so focused on their own survival that the interview felt like an intrusion into something more pressing. Mara Linfield was none of those things. She was present and measured and precise, and she answered every question in a straight line from what she had observed to what she had concluded, without embellishment and without minimizing. She described the parking garage in the specific spatial way of someone who had assessed environments professionally. The light levels, the positions of the officers, the location of the equipment case relative to her body when Decker fired. She described her own movements with the same objectivity she would have applied to a patient's presentation. She did not describe her fear, which Reyes noticed but did not ask about, because it was not what the statement required, and because the absence of it was its own kind of information. Not that Mara hadn't been afraid, but that she had learned, somewhere in 9 years of doing what she did, how to hold fear in a separate compartment while the part of her that functioned kept functioning. The statement took 1 hour and 6 minutes. When it was finished, Reyes set her pen down and looked at Mara directly. I want you to know where things stand, she said. Burrell is in federal custody. Decker was arrested this morning. Price is currently being located. He attempted to leave the area last night. Mara absorbed this without visible reaction. Voight is cooperating, Reyes added. His attorney confirmed full cooperation this morning. What did Voight give you? Mara asked. Reyes was quiet for a moment, not because she was deciding whether to answer, but because she was deciding how to frame the answer accurately. He gave us a name, she said, above his level. Someone in the department's command structure who was aware of the complaint suppression pattern and had actively participated in shaping the personnel review process to prevent formal escalation. Mara looked at her. Who? She asked. Deputy Commissioner Gerald Farron, Reyes said. He oversees internal personnel compliance for the department. He was the signing authority on the conduct review that cleared Decker for continued active duty last year. She paused. Voight says Farron knew about the Voss complaint and specifically instructed him that it was not to leave the division level. The room was quiet. Mara thought about the shape of it. Farron, a name she had never heard, in an office she had never thought about, making a decision about a complaint she had never been told existed, and that decision creating the conditions for what had happened to her in a parking garage. She had walked through 100 times without a second thought. It was not a satisfying feeling, understanding that. It was something more uncomfortable, The specific knowledge that the thing that had happened to her had been made more likely, made more possible, by a sequence of decisions made by people who would never have described themselves as capable of it. "Is Ferran going to be charged?" she asked. "We're building toward that," Reyes said. "Voigt's statement is a starting point. We need corroboration, and we're working on it. But yes, that's the direction." Mara nodded slowly. "One more question," she said. "Go ahead." "The people in this department who knew things were wrong and didn't report them, not Voight, not the ones who actively suppressed it, but the ones who just stayed quiet. What happens to them?" Reyes held her gaze. "That depends on what they do now," she said honestly. "We've already had one officer come forward voluntarily. How many more do that, and what they bring, is going to shape what the prosecution looks like for the outer circle." She paused. "I can't promise everyone who stayed quiet faces consequences. That's not how prosecution works at scale. But the culture that made silence the rational choice, the system that built those incentives, that's what this case is actually going after." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. It was a complicated okay, not satisfied, not resigned, but the particular acknowledgement of a person who understood that justice worked in specifics and not in totalities, and who had decided to accept that without letting it undermine what was still possible. Price was located at 4:47 p.m. He had made it as far as a motel off the interstate 68 miles east of Calverton, where he had paid cash for a room and had apparently spent most of the day sitting on the bed watching the news coverage of his own arrest warrant. The tower pings had narrowed to a half-mile radius by noon, and 2 federal marshals with local law enforcement support had worked the motel strip methodically until they found his vehicle in a lot behind a diner. Price did not run when they came to the door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed. The television was on. One of the local news channels had a graphic on screen with both his name and Decker's. He looked at the marshals when they entered and said, "I know," before they had said anything, and then he said, "I shouldn't have run," which was accurate and 3 days too late. He was in federal custody by 5:30 p.m. The news cycle picked up the arrest within the hour. By 6 o'clock, all 3 major networks and every local affiliate in the region had confirmed. 2 Calverton officers arrested on federal civil rights and obstruction charges, their supervisor in custody on obstruction and conspiracy, and an ongoing investigation into the department's command structure. The story had a shape now. It had names and charges, and a federal process that would grind forward regardless of what any individual inside the Calverton PD wanted. Mara watched 12 minutes of it, which was longer than that morning, but still less than the full segment. She watched Decker's name appear on screen, then Price's, then Burrell's. She watched a reporter she didn't recognize stand in front of the federal courthouse and describe the evidence with reasonable accuracy. Then she turned it off. She was not satisfied in the way that movies suggested you should be satisfied when the people who hurt you were arrested. She was something quieter than that, and something more complicated. The specific feeling of watching a process move correctly, of watching the mechanisms work the way they were supposed to work, while also knowing that the 3 hours she had spent on a surgery table and the drain in her side and the months of physical therapy ahead of her were not going to be undone by any number of correctly executed federal warrants. What had happened to her had happened. What happened next was different. She picked up her phone and called Whitman. "Decker and Price are in custody," she said. "Burrell, too." Price tried to run. "I saw," Whitman said. "How are you?" "I gave my statement this afternoon. They're looking at the deputy commissioner." "Mara." Whitman's voice shifted slightly. "How are you?" A pause. "I'm working on it," she said for the second time in as many days. "That's different from yesterday's answer," Whitman said. Mara considered that. "Maybe," she said. She ended the call and sat with the room and the quiet and the specific ache of a body that was healing on its own timeline, regardless of what the rest of the situation was doing. She was still sitting with it at 7 p.m. when Graves knocked and came in. His face was different from that morning. She read it immediately. "What happened?" she asked. He came to the chair and sat down, which he didn't always do, and she knew before he spoke that this was not an update in the normal sense, not another arrest, not another piece of evidence. This was something that had a different quality. "Voigt's statement went to the U.S. Attorney's Office at 5:30, Graves said. Ferran was notified that he was a subject of investigation at 6. Okay, Mara said. At 6:40, Farron's personal attorney contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office. Graves paused. Farron is requesting immunity in exchange for testimony. Mara went still. Immunity, she said. He says the complaint suppression protocol didn't originate with him, Graves said. He says he was following a directive from above his level. The room was very quiet. Above his level, Mara said slowly. Farron is the deputy commissioner. Yes, Graves said. That means above his level is the commissioner's office, Graves said. Yes. She looked at the window. Outside, the Calverton evening was ordinary and dark, and entirely unaware that the investigation that had started with a parking garage had just extended its reach to the top of the city's law enforcement command. She looked back at Graves. How long has this been going on? She asked. Graves met her eyes. That, he said, is what we're about to find out. The question of how long it had been going on took 3 weeks to answer fully, and the answer was worse than anyone had publicly estimated. Reyes spent those 3 weeks in the kind of sustained, grinding investigative work that bore no resemblance to anything dramatic. It was document requests and cross-referenced personnel files and 17 separate interviews with current and former members of the Calverton PD, conducted in conference rooms and attorneys' offices, and, twice, in the parking lots of places the witnesses had chosen because they didn't want to be seen walking into a federal building. It was the slow, unglamorous machinery of accountability, which moved on its own schedule and answered to no one's impatience, not even hers. Deputy Commissioner Gerald Farron's immunity request took 4 days to negotiate. His attorney pushed for full immunity. Reyes offered use immunity on his direct testimony and nothing more, which meant that what he said in cooperation could not be used against him directly, but that anything investigators found independently could still support charges against him. It was a narrower protection than Farron wanted and a broader one than Reyes preferred, and they settled on it at 9 a.m. on a Thursday, while Mara was in her third session with the physical therapist assigned to her shoulder. What Farron provided, once the agreement was signed, was a documented account of a directive that had originated in the office of Commissioner Alan Scheck, the head of the entire Calverton Police Department, approximately 4 years earlier. The directive, never written down in any form that could be directly attributed, had been communicated verbally through a chain of command meetings and had established, with unmistakable clarity, that conduct complaints against officers with high clearance rates were to be managed at the division level and were not to generate upward escalation unless the complainant was a public figure or the media was already involved. Clearance rates, in policing, referred to the percentage of cases an officer closed. Decker's clearance rate was among the highest in his precinct. He closed cases. He got results. And for 4 years, the implicit understanding inside the department's command structure had been that officers who closed cases were valuable enough to protect from the friction of formal accountability. Scheck had never used those words. He had never put anything in writing. He had simply created an environment in which the message was clear and the consequences of ignoring it were understood. And the people below him had built the machinery of suppression themselves, brick by careful brick, because that was how institutional cultures worked when they went wrong. Not through conspiracy, but through incentive, not through orders, but through the demonstrated rewards of compliance. Farron gave Reyes dates and names in the specific language used in the command meetings where the directive had been communicated. He gave her the names of 3 other officers in different precincts whose conduct complaints had been handled the same way Decker's had. He gave her, finally, a text message he had saved on his personal phone, a message from Scheck's personal cell sent 18 months ago that read, "Keep the Decker matter internal. He's too valuable to lose over a complaint from someone on the way out." Voss. On the way out. A medical retirement. Reyes read the message and then set the phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you were managing the impulse to react before you'd fully processed what was in your hands. That's Scheck's number? She confirmed. I can provide the carrier verification, Farron's attorney said. I'll need it, Reyes said. She left the meeting and called the U.S. attorney from the hallway. We have Scheck, she said. A pause. How solid? The U.S. attorney asked. Text message from his personal device. Farron's direct testimony. 3 other officers whose complaint histories match the same suppression pattern. She paused. It's solid. Get me everything by Friday, the U.S. attorney said. I want to present to the grand jury next week. Mara found out about Sheck the same way most of Calverton did, through a news alert on her phone, on a Tuesday morning. While she was doing the shoulder rotation exercises, the physical therapist had demonstrated with the careful optimism of someone who had learned to present ambitious recovery timelines in ways that sounded achievable. She stopped mid-rotation and read the alert. Calverton Police Commissioner Alan Sheck placed on administrative leave pending federal investigation. U.S. Attorney's Office confirms grand jury proceedings related to systemic misconduct within the department. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and finished the rotation, because the exercises had a sequence and stopping in the middle of the sequence was counterproductive. And because she had spent enough time in the last 3 weeks sitting with the weight of what was happening to understand that the process moved with or without her active attention, and her shoulder was not going to heal itself. She called Graves afterward. "Sheck," she said. "Yes," he said. "The grand jury." "Next week. Reyes has everything she needs." A pause. "How's the shoulder?" "Getting there." "There," she said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office would like you to testify in the federal proceedings. Formal request is coming through legal channels this week." "I know," she said. "I'll be there." She ended the call and sat in the small living room of her apartment, which she had returned to 10 days after the shooting against Dr. Okafor's preferred timeline, but within the range Okafor had acknowledged was medically defensible if Mara was careful, which was the only concession Okafor was willing to make, and the only one Mara had asked for. The apartment was the same as she'd left it, organized, spare, the particular order of someone who had learned that chaos in your environment compounded chaos everywhere else. The drawer in her bedroom still contained the bronze star in its case. She had not moved it. She thought about Sheck. She had never met the man. She had walked past his name on a department directory in the lobby of the precinct the one time she had dealt with Calverton PD. A routine coordination meeting about emergency response protocols 2 years before any of this happened. He had been a name at the top of an org chart, a signature at the bottom of official correspondence. He had been, in a very specific and functional sense, the reason she had been shot. Not because he had ordered it, not because he had known it was coming, but because he had spent 4 years building a culture inside his department where the officers most likely to do what Decker had done were also the ones most insulated from the consequences of doing it, and that culture had produced, with a kind of terrible logic, the night in the parking garage. She did not feel what she expected to feel about that. She expected anger, the clean, directional kind that had somewhere to go. What she felt instead was something more diffuse and harder to name, the specific exhaustion of understanding that the thing that had happened to her had not been exceptional. It had been the product of a system functioning exactly as it had been shaped to function. And the question of how many times, in how many parking garages and traffic stops and processing rooms across how many departments, that same system had produced that same result, with witnesses who stayed quiet and complaints that went inconclusive, and people who pressed their own hands to their own wounds and waited for someone to believe them. That question was too large to hold all at once. She held what she could. She got up and made coffee and went back to her shoulder exercises because the sequence wasn't finished. The federal grand jury proceedings lasted 11 days. Mara testified on the 4th day. She wore her army uniform. Not as a statement. She had thought about whether it would read as a statement and had decided it didn't matter because the uniform was accurate, and accuracy was the only standard she applied to how she showed up for things that required her to be present completely. She walked into the federal courthouse in downtown Calverton on a morning that had finally turned toward spring, the air lighter than it had been in weeks, and she walked without a cane because the cane had been advisory since day 3 of discharge, and she had treated it as such. Her shoulder was still in a partial brace. She moved with the specific deliberateness of someone managing pain that was present but not in charge. Reyes met her in the hallway outside the grand jury room. "You don't have to go through the whole thing," Reyes said. "Just what you witnessed directly. They'll ask about the parking garage, your service record, and potentially the pattern of conduct as it relates to what you experienced." "I know how testimony works," Mara said. Reyes looked at her. "I know you do." A pause. "For what it's worth, the case that's in that room right now exists because of what you didn't do." Mara looked at her. "You didn't disappear," Reyes said. A lot of people in your situation disappear into the process and let other people carry it. You stayed in it. That mattered. Mara said, I just told the truth. Yeah, Reyes said. That's rarer than it should be. The grand jury room was smaller than she expected, the way institutional spaces often were in person, stripped of the weight that the idea of them carried. She sat in the witness chair and answered questions for 92 minutes, and she did it the same way she had given her statement in the hospital. Straight line, no embellishment, no minimizing. She described the parking garage in the same spatial, specific terms. She described her service history when asked, without apology and without performance. She described what it had felt like to press her hand to her own wound on the floor of the parking structure, not because the question asked for that, but because accuracy required it, and accuracy was the standard. When the lead juror asked her whether she believed the shooting was deliberate, she said, I believe the conditions that made it possible were deliberate. Whether Decker intended to kill me or simply didn't care whether he did, I can't answer that. But I can tell you that the system that kept him armed and on the street for 4 years after the first complaint was filed, that was intentional. The room was quiet after that. She was finished by noon. She walked out of the federal courthouse into the first genuinely warm day Calverton had seen since October, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed the air and did not feel relief exactly. Relief implied that the danger was over, and the danger of systems like the one she'd walked through was that they didn't end with one investigation, one prosecution, one set of charges. They required sustained pressure and structural change and a consistent willingness to stay uncomfortable. But something had shifted. Something had moved. She walked to her car and drove back to Harmon Medical because she had a meeting with the charge nurse coordinator about the phased return-to-work timeline, and the shoulder brace was not going to be an obstacle to that conversation. The grand jury returned indictments on a Friday. Commissioner Alan Scheck was indicted on federal charges of conspiracy to deprive civil rights, obstruction of justice, and abuse of official authority. The indictment was unsealed at 10 a.m., and Scheck was taken into federal custody by 10:45 at the department's administrative headquarters, which was a building Mara had never been inside and which now had news cameras on every approach by 11 a.m. Sergeant Thomas Burrell was indicted on obstruction, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation, the last charge based on the phone calls to Harmon Medical Center, which the carrier data had conclusively linked to the burner device found in his vehicle during the arrest search. He entered a guilty plea to 3 of the 4 charges 8 days later, in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that his attorney believed was the best available outcome, and that Burrell accepted with the look of a man who had run his calculations to the end and found there was only one door left. Officers Decker and Price went to federal trial 6 months after the indictments. The trial lasted 9 days. The parking garage footage was played on the first day, the body camera audio on the second, the dispatch log, the biomedical services checkout record, the 3 prior complaints, the Voss recording, Sett's testimony, Ferran's testimony, and Voigt's cooperation statement followed in sequence over the remaining days, building a case that had the specific compressive weight of evidence that had been assembled carefully rather than quickly. Decker's attorney argued that the shooting was a split-second decision made under genuine perceived threat. The footage made that argument very difficult. The prior conduct record made it harder. The coaching audio from Burrell's interview made it very nearly impossible because it established that the story Decker had told was not the product of a traumatized officer's honest recollection, but of a collaborative effort to construct a defensible account after the fact. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Decker was convicted on all counts: unlawful use of force, civil rights violation, falsification of federal records, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Price was convicted on unlawful use of force, civil rights violation, and falsification. His attorney successfully argued diminished culpability on the obstruction count. Price had followed Decker's lead in the report rather than initiating the falsification, and he received 7 years. Scheck's trial came 4 months after Decker and Price were sentenced. It was longer, more complicated, fought with the resources that a man of his position could marshal, and it ultimately produced a conviction on conspiracy and civil rights charges. He was sentenced to 6 years and removed from office permanently. His law enforcement certification was revoked. The department's pension board voted, after a legal challenge that took 8 additional months to resolve, to strip his departmental pension. Farhan, under his use immunity agreement, was not prosecuted on the charges covered by his testimony. He was, however, prosecuted on a separate obstruction count that emerged from evidence gathered independently of his cooperation, a second set of communications that Reyes's team found during the document review, related to a complaint suppression that predated Decker by 2 years. He received a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised release. He lost his position and his certification. His attorney considered this a favorable outcome. Most people who read the sentencing report did not. Voigt resigned before charges were formally recommended against him. His cooperation had been substantive enough that the U.S. attorney ultimately declined to prosecute him directly, a decision that generated its own controversy and that Reyes acknowledged in an interview months later was the kind of outcome that the mechanics of prosecution sometimes required. And that was not the same as justice in the fullest sense of the word. Burrell received 4 years following his plea. The 2 officers who had corroborated Decker's account in the Voss complaint review were suspended and subsequently terminated after the investigation established that their accounts had been coordinated with Burrell's coaching. Neither was prosecuted. There was insufficient evidence to support a criminal case, but their law enforcement careers ended. Sett, whose voluntary testimony had been a significant element of the federal case, received a formal commendation from the U.S. Attorney's Office. He remained on the force in a different precinct under the new departmental oversight structure that followed the investigation. He was not comfortable with the commendation and declined to be photographed for the department's press release about it, which Reyes found understandable. Sandra Voss, who had kept a recording on an encrypted drive for 14 months because she had understood that evidence needed a future to speak into, received a letter from the U.S. attorney acknowledging her role in the investigation. She framed it. She put it in her home office, next to the framed certificate from her 18 years of service, and did not hold a press conference or give interviews because she was a private person who had done a professional thing and considered that sufficient. The Calverton Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree requiring independent oversight of all use-of-force incidents, mandatory third-party review of internal affairs decisions, and a restructured complaint intake system that removed divisional command from the initial review process. The consent decree ran for 5 years, with annual compliance reviews. It was not a perfect outcome. Consent decrees rarely were. They required sustained monitoring and political will and the continued attention of people who had other things competing for their attention. And the history of such agreements was complicated enough that Reyes, when asked about it at a conference 8 months after the decree was signed, was careful to say that it was a mechanism rather than a guarantee. But it was something that had not existed before. And it existed now because a woman had walked across a parking garage with a defibrillator case and had refused to disappear from what happened to her. Mara returned to the Harmon Medical Center Emergency Department 14 weeks after the shooting. It was not the triumphant return she had occasionally imagined in the early days of recovery, when imagining it had been a coping mechanism rather than a plan. Her shoulder was functional but not fully recovered. It would continue to recover for months, and the physical therapist had been specific about what full recovery meant in practical terms, which was good range of motion and manageable chronic ache, not the absence of consequence. Her abdominal scar was the kind that faded rather than vanished, a thin line that she sometimes forgot about and sometimes didn't. She came back for a half shift first, then a full shift, then the rotation. The ED staff received her the way hospital staffs received people who had been through something significant, with the careful normalcy that was the most generous thing they could offer, treating her like a colleague rather than a cause, which was exactly what she needed and what she would have been unable to articulate as a need if asked. Dr. Okafor stopped her in the hallway on her 3rd day back. "How are you actually doing?" Okafor asked. "Better than projected on the abdominal side," Mara said. "The shoulder is a longer conversation." Okafor looked at her in the way that surgeons who were also perceptive humans sometimes looked at patients they had pulled back from something serious. "I didn't ask about the wounds," she said. Mara held her gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. A pause. "I'm working on it," she said. Okafor nodded because she understood what that meant from this particular person. Not evasion, but the honest report of someone who was doing the actual work of recovery and refused to describe it as more resolved than it was. "Good," Okafor said. "That's the right answer." Watson. 3 things happened in the months after Mara returned to work that she would not have anticipated from her ICU bed in those first strange days of recovery. The first was that Harmon Medical's board, in a session that Mara was not invited to and did not ask to attend, voted to establish what they called the Linfield Emergency Preparedness Program, a structured training initiative that would bring combat triage methodology into the hospital's mass casualty response protocols. The program's development was offered to Mara as a consulting project alongside her clinical work, and she accepted it with conditions. She would design the training content, and she would deliver the initial sessions herself, but the program would carry her name only if it was genuinely useful and not if it was ceremonial. The board agreed to this condition, which surprised the board member who had expected her to be more easily managed. The program launched 7 months after the shooting. It was not named after her in the end. She had looked at the draft materials and found that having her name on it made the material feel like a monument rather than a tool, and tools were more useful than monuments, so she asked for the name to be changed. The board compromised on Harmon Combat Readiness Training, which was accurate and said nothing about anyone in particular, which was how she preferred it. The second thing was a call she received from a journalist at a national publication who was writing a long investigation into conduct complaint suppression across municipal police departments, and who had been directed to Mara by Reyes as someone who could speak to the structural dimension of what the Calverton case had revealed. Mara spent 45 minutes on the phone with the journalist, speaking not about her personal experience, but about the systemic mechanics, how clearance rate incentives created protection structures, how complaint intake processes concentrated review, authority in the exact places most likely to be compromised, how the cost-benefit calculation for silence was manufactured rather than natural. She was specific, and she was not particularly quotable in the way that journalists sometimes hoped for, because she was not interested in being vivid. She was interested in being accurate. The piece ran 4 months later. It quoted her twice, once on the incentive structure and once on the consent decree's design. She read both quotes and found them accurate representations of what she had said, which was the highest standard she held for anything that carried her name. The piece was read widely. It contributed in ways that were real but not easily measured, to a policy conversation that was already in motion and that became, over the following year, a legislative proposal in 3 states for independent oversight of police complaint review processes. Mara did not take credit for this. She would have found it both inaccurate and uncomfortable to do so. She had made one phone call to a journalist who had asked good questions. The people who had filed the complaints and kept the recordings and walked into courthouses without lawyers and stayed on the phone with investigators at 2 in the morning. They had done the work. She had been one of them in her specific way. That was enough. The third thing was quieter than either of the first two and happened on an ordinary evening in her apartment, late in the fall, when she opened the drawer in her bedroom and took out the bronze star in its case. She had not looked at it in nearly a year. She had not looked at it much before the shooting either. It had sat in the drawer as a fact about her past rather than a fact about who she was, which had felt like the appropriate relationship to have with it. She opened the case and looked at the metal for a while. She thought about the convoy. She thought about the dust and the weight of the casualty on her back, and the specific moment when she had understood that the extraction team was not coming in time, and she had looked at the situation and calculated what could still be done, and had done it, not because she was fearless, but because the math was clear, and someone had to do it, and she was the someone who was there. She thought about the parking garage, about being on the floor with the equipment case beside her and her hand pressed to her own side, thinking about the camera in the corner of level 3 and whether it was recording. She thought about the difference between those 2 moments and the fact that they were both hers, both part of the same record, the same person, the same stubborn refusal to stop functioning before the work was done. She closed the case. She put it on her bookshelf, where she could see it. It took her a while to understand why that felt right and the drawer had not. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't performance. It was something more like insisting on accuracy, refusing to hide the record, refusing to act as if what she had done and survived and earned was something to keep out of sight, because other people found it inconvenient or confronting or easier to dismiss. She had spent too long making herself smaller to fit other people's expectations of what she should be. That was over now. Graves came to Harmon Medical one last time on a Tuesday afternoon in late November with a formal letter from the Army and a small ceremony that Mara had agreed to only because Graves had framed it not as recognition but as documentation. The distinction mattered to her. He presented her with a Distinguished Service Commendation that cited her combat record, her actions during the investigation, and her testimony in the federal proceedings. There were 7 people in the room: Graves, Pratt, Okafor, Whitman, who had driven up from Nashville, 2 members of the ED nursing staff, and Walter Fenwick, who had come because he felt it was appropriate, and who stood in the corner with the specific dignity of a man who understood he was a witness rather than a participant. Mara accepted the commendation. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at the room. "I want to say something," she said, which was not what Graves had expected because she had told him in advance that she would not be making a speech. The room went quiet. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I'm good at the work. I'm good at staying in the procedure when everything else is coming apart. I'm not particularly good at talking about what it means." She paused. "So I'm not going to try to make it mean something elegant. I'm just going to say what's true." She looked at Whitman, who had driven 4 hours on a Tuesday. She looked at Pratt, who had pulled carrier metadata at 2 in the morning and had not asked whether she was being paid overtime. She looked at Okafor, who had spent 3 hours ensuring she survived to be standing in this room. "People think that what happened to me was about me," she said. "It wasn't. It was about a system that had been failing people for a long time, and the fact that I was the one who happened to be in the parking garage that night. That was circumstance. What mattered was whether anyone was going to stay with it after the fact, whether anyone was going to refuse to let it get marked inconclusive." She stopped. "A lot of people stayed with it," she said. "I want that on the record. Not me. The record." She sat down. Graves looked at her for a moment and then said, "Noted," which was probably the only response she would have accepted, and which he had understood before he walked into the room. The thing that Mara came to understand over the long months of recovery and testimony and the grinding forward of the legal process was something she did not have clean language for and did not try to reduce to clean language. It was the understanding that the people who had dismissed her, in that parking garage, in those complaint files, in the memo on the deputy commissioner's letterhead, had not been dismissing her specifically. They had been dismissing the idea that she was real. The idea that the person in front of them had a full interior life, a complete history, a record that existed and mattered and could not be made inconvenient by treating it as non-existent. That was what dismissal always was, underneath its specific shapes. It was the insistence that you were easier to manage as a category than as a person. And what she had learned, not from this experience but confirmed by it, was that the answer to that insistence was not to perform your realness more loudly or to present your credentials more urgently or to make yourself more legible to people who had decided not to look. The answer was to be exactly what you were, accurately and without apology, and to stay in the room, and to trust that the record would eventually speak in a language that the people who needed to hear it could not choose to ignore. The record had spoken. It had taken a parking garage and 3 hours of surgery and 14 weeks of recovery and 11 days of grand jury proceedings and months of federal trial and a consent decree and a legislative proposal and a program that taught emergency nurses how to stay functional when everything was coming apart. It had taken also a woman with a phone number on an encrypted drive and a man who walked into a courthouse in his uniform and an investigator who drove to a hospital at midnight and a surgeon who spent 3 hours ensuring there would be a morning after, and a senior NCO who drove 4 hours on a Tuesday because that was the kind of person she was. It had taken all of that. That was how it always took. Not through one person's extraordinary capability, but through the accumulation of people who decided, each in their own moment, that the truth was worth their effort. Mara did not consider herself extraordinary. She was competent and stubborn, and she knew how to stay functional under pressure, and she had a very high tolerance for being underestimated, which had turned out to be a useful trait. She was not fearless. She had been afraid in that parking garage, specifically and concretely afraid in the way that a body was afraid when it understood it was being shot at. And she had been afraid in the ICU, and she had been afraid on the courthouse steps before her testimony. Not that she would say the wrong thing, but that the right thing would not be enough. It had been enough. Not because she had been exceptional, but because she had been accurate, and she had been present, and she had refused to make herself smaller than what she was, and the people around her had done the same. She was in the ED on a Thursday evening, 6 months after the commendation, when the paramedics brought in a trauma case, a young woman, late 20s, a bad car accident on the interstate. And the team moved around the gurney with the coordinated urgency of people who had practiced this until the practice became instinct. Mara was at the woman's left, running vitals, calling out what she needed, her shoulder functioning within its current range, and her hands steady in the way that her hands had been steady, under pressure, for as long as she could remember. The young woman was conscious, frightened, looking at the ceiling lights moving past above her. "Am I going to be okay?" she asked. Mara looked at her. She thought about the parking garage. She thought about pressing her own hand to her own side. She thought about the ICU ceiling and the green peaks of the monitor and the specific stubbornness of a body that had decided it was not finished yet. "Yes," she said. And she meant it as a clinical assessment, which was the only kind she made, and which in this case was also true. The team worked. The work was ordinary and essential and exactly what it was supposed to be. And Mara Linfield, Army veteran, trauma nurse, woman who had been shot in a parking garage and had pressed her own hand to her own wound and waited for the record to speak. She stayed in the procedure the way she always had, because the work was the thing that mattered, and it was not finished yet, and she was still the someone who was here.